Hey friends, so, everybody complains about something sometime somewhere. It's just what we do because whether we like it or not, human beings have a negativity bias that is ingrained in us. It's evolutionary, so it's kind of a default setting. That's the bad news, sorry. But the good news is that you can change that setting a little bit, or at least keep it in check more than you might be doing right now. All it takes is a little work and also understanding what the real nature of your complaints are. That is the aim of this video. Now, while complaining is normal, doing it more often than not about anything and everything really isn't normal. And it's not good for your health, mental or in general, actually. The fact that complaining isn't good for you is hardly a mystery. We learn this many times throughout our lives, starting in childhood when we are told not to whine or complain, not to be a Debbie Downer or a negative Norman, and even in adulthood when we are reminded by well-intentioned folks to count our blessings instead of our problems or be thankful. I mean, telling us this really doesn't solve or change anything, but to be fair, most of the time, neither does complaining. So, since we know that complaining all the time isn't good for you, and it doesn't change anything, and it makes you unpleasant to be around, why do we do it as often as we do? And why do we sometimes have these seasons of our lives where it feels like that's pretty much all we're doing? Well, here might be some reasons why. First, sometimes complaining is simply a way of coping. Plain and simple. Complaining or venting is often a far more healthy release than not doing it, because keeping in your negative emotions all the time poisons you from the inside. And it also gives you a temporary feeling of having some semblance of power over the situation, and that, too, is healthier than not having it at all. I mean, nobody wants to feel like they're powerless and not in control of their own lives. I mean, again, complaining isn't going to change the situation itself. However, there are some exceptions, such as complaining repeatedly to somebody else, say, about, the taste of something that is much beloved, and the person who makes the change hears enough of that and gets motivated to change it back, such as what happened with New Coke back in the 80s. Young people, Google it. But for the most part, complaining itself doesn't change much. But it does give you the feeling that you have that control, even if it is just to use your voice against the thing that you're complaining about. It also helps you to connect with other people who dislike the same thing too, and that makes you feel less alone or strange for disliking that thing. And it's a bit cathartic sometimes too. So that is what I mean by using it as a coping mechanism. Then there are people who complain all the time because that is who it seems they pretty much are as a person. They are the people who are always miserable. Nothing is ever good enough. That you can't talk to them about anything because everything is terrible and it sucks and it's awful. Are people like this because they are rehearsing for the part of Ebenezer Scrooge in the latest reboot of Dickens' A Christmas Carol? It may seem that way, but probably not. The truth is that they're probably just deeply unhappy within themselves, and that is how it is manifesting. Contrary to popular belief, nobody is born a cranky old fart. But people can certainly be made into that, because when they repeatedly feel like they're not listened to or noticed or supported by others, you get a little salty. This is, by the way, how a lot of children become bullies. I'm a firm believer that this behavior is something that starts at home, whether it be by example or not. Kids are not as good at regulating their emotions as adults are. So when they feel like they're not liked, they're not understood, they're not being listened to, they're not seen, they're being excluded, etc., they are much more likely to act those emotions out instead of internalize it like a lot of adults do. And when they do act those emotions out, they will generally do so on someone else that they see as weak or weaker than them or different. It helps them deflect from those emotions within them that they don't understand. And I'm not going to wax poetic about child psychology here because that's not really my jam whatsoever. But let me say this. While kids grow out of a lot of those immature behaviors on their own, more often than not, asshole kids grow up to be asshole adults. And that's why things like being empathetic and understanding and a good human in general are such valuable things to teach your children. And they learn it best by example. Just saying. Anyway, I digress. And then, finally, you have the rest of us. I guess you would call average people who will sometimes go through this season of our lives where nothing seems to be going the way we planned or wanted. We feel restless and miserable and like we're treading water, and you find yourself complaining a lot more than you typically do, and you're grumpier than usual too. Where those feelings might come from is really anyone's guess, because obviously each person is different, and sometimes we just find ourselves in a funk for no particular reason that we can readily identify. All we know is that everything feels wrong and we hate it. So we complain about it a lot. And that doesn't really help, but it is what it is, right? When you find yourself there, in that place, there is a reason that you might not be thinking about that you are there. So I'm going to say it out loud for you to ponder. Those complaints that you have, those are probably unmet needs in disguise. One of the best ways to figure out what you seem to be missing, what you need, is to take a long, hard look at what you are complaining about. I'll give you an example from real life. Say you have a friend that you love dearly but is a drama llama, and that is all that you can ever talk about. Their issues, their things, their whatevers. You rarely ever have a conversation that is not about them, or them airing their grievances, or their problems, or their this or their that, for the entirety of that conversation. And no matter what you are going through or what you have on your mind, you don't get to express it, because even when you try to, it gets ignored. Or let's say you are newly dating someone and you are trying very hard to get their attention. You are always the first one to call or text. You're the one who makes all the plans. You are the one who does all the things. They constantly prioritize things they're doing with other people over you, and that bothers you. But because you're truly interested in them, you keep giving them a chance and you keep making an effort. Then, one day, you finally corner them into going out to dinner with you. But they sit on their phone the whole time during that dinner, or they invite other people to come too, making it impossible to have a private conversation one-on-one. Both of those examples are different in nature, but they are certainly something that you would complain about, right? They have a common denominator too. Both individuals in question are selfish and not very good friends or possible partners, to say the least. So after your encounter with those people, what usually happens next? In the case of the drama llama friend, you probably vent to another friend, or perhaps several of them, about that person's failure to listen to you or care about anything but themselves. After the date, you probably also call one of your friends, or maybe the same friends, to complain and to look for them to tell you that that person is probably not for you, even though, well, you probably figured that out already, I would say. In both cases also, what does complaining actually accomplish for you? Well, first of all, it allows you to release those emotions that feel icky, but it also gives the way you feel a source. You figure out where that is coming from. It is sort of like a message in your brain that says, psst, your needs are not being met. They are not being seen. And don't get me wrong, you may not realize it at first. Unmet needs are tricky that way sometimes. I know in my own personal experiences, I have ignored the warning signs through either denial or willful blindness. In fact, that is what motivated me to start this channel in the first place. My own struggles with some of the things we talk about here. But the thing is that unmet needs are like everything else. You can't fix them until you are aware that they exist. And sometimes the only way they come to light is when you have honest conversations with yourself about why you're complaining so much, why you're so grumpy. And sometimes it also takes someone else to come along and be all of the things that those other people weren't for you, hypothetically speaking. Sometimes you really come to see just what a good friend someone is when you look around and realize when other people continually disappoint you, that person never does. Or in romantic relationships, you meet someone who listens to you, who you know sees you, who is willing to match your effort, and who cares about the things that are important to you too, not just to them. If there's one thing I've learned about those types of relationships in the last few years, it's been this. When people show you signs of their true self early on in relationships of any kind, you should pay attention, because people tell on themselves a lot more than you realize. That isn't always negative either. There are plenty of times when you meet someone, whether it be a friend or otherwise, and they will show you signs of goodness and true caring from the very beginning. But we don't always see things that way because, again, that negative bias. And honestly, you cheat yourself out of happiness and real human connections when you do that. We're going to talk specifically about that in a later video, but in this one, back to the subject of unmet needs. We are not always aware when our needs are not being met, and very often you will find that this can only go on for so long before, once again, your brain steps in and tells you it's time to do something about this. If you've ever woken up one day and decided that today is the day that you are 100% done with someone's shit, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. But before you get to that point, there are always some signs that something isn't quite working for you, even if you don't do anything about it beforehand. The thing with unmet needs is that even when they are unmet, they are still needs. You're not going to be happy until you meet them. And you're probably just going to keep complaining about them and then eventually build resentment. We've talked about resentment before on this channel and why it's such an unhealthy emotion. So you can go back and find those videos if you want to know more about that. The simple answer here seems to be figure out what need is not being met in your relationships, make the changes necessary in order for them to be met, and then you'll stop complaining. That's it. Easy, right? Well, saying it is, being told by someone else is too, but actually doing it, taking action, that is much harder. Because so often we will say that we want change, but we don't want to get uncomfortable to do it, and that is not how change works. Change requires discomfort every single time and doing things differently also. That means you also have to make moves that are uncertain. That is why it is called change. So at some point, especially when you find yourself complaining about the same things over and over, you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do about this? How am I going to change the things that obviously aren't working in order for me to start meeting my needs? This is not in any way an easy conversation to have with yourself, trust me, but it's a really important one because unmet needs are still going to be there even if you ignore them. They just don't go away on their own. They usually only lead to a different unword, unhappiness, and a lot of other things too, like jealousy, resentment, bitterness, getting stuck in a comparison trap, anxiety, lots of other negative stuff too. And one big thing that is very frequently birthed from having unmet needs is that you can become increasingly apathetic and your ability to feel empathy for others decreases and becomes strained. I guess that is not really that much of a stretch, right? I mean, of course, you become a lot more indifferent and uncaring towards other people when you are unhappy too. So, friends, I'll leave you with this. When you find yourself in one of these cycles where you are complaining all the time and wondering why you are just unhappy and miserable more often than you're happy, get in touch with yourself and figure out why. Check your needs. Chances are that the answers are right there, that you have some or perhaps many that are not being met. And don't depend on other people to meet them for you. That will leave you disappointed every damn time. Ask me how I know. Instead, put that task of taking care of you and your needs where it belongs on you. Making sure that your needs are met isn't just your job, my friends. It should be your priority. Don't be afraid to take the steps you need to take in order to do that. That's all I've got for you this week. I will be back next week with another priority message. Until then, take good care of yourselves. Bye.